Support for WBFO, your NPR station, comes from our members and from the Unitarian Universalists of Amherst. UU Amherst is an open-minded, open-hearted faith community whose members value love, learning, and hope. The UU's mission is to foster compassion, justice, and interdependence on earth. UU of Amherst is located at 6320 Main Street in Williamsville and has a Living Green Festival September 9th through 11th. www.uuamherst.org.
Yes, good morning. And welcome to the Unitarian Universalist Church of Amherst. I'm Ron Palmieri. I'm an active member of our church. We're glad that you've chosen to be with us this morning, either virtually or in person. Our minister, Reverend Michelle Buhite, is still on sabbatical just through the end of this month. And services during this time have included guest speakers with the assistance from the sabbatical team, and even more assistance from our tech crew, our greeters, weavers, ushers, musicians, coffee makers, who seek to create a safe and inviting space for all of us here in the sanctuary of UU Amherst. A reminder, the Living Green Festival is 2 weeks away. It's going to be September 9th through the 11th, and all hands are needed to make it a success by volunteering and by coming to the activities. We'll be going around with volunteer sheets after the service, so be forewarned. I encourage you to seriously consider volunteering just in some capacity. Dr. Les Buhite is probably vaguely familiar to many of you in the congregation. During Sunday service, he is usually up in the loft supervising the media elements. During the week, he's usually huddled in his basement editing the videos. In odd hours, he's often found in the back property, referred to as the Waterhouse Ecology Center, rearranging nature and plotting new deviltry. I'm only reading what's here. Les was a theater major once upon a time in a previous life at Edinburgh University of Pennsylvania and received a master's degree at the University of Akron and a PhD at Florida State University. He's married to our minister, Reverend Michelle Buhite, is the proud father of Ashra DeRosa and grandfather to two adorable twins, Sienna and Sonnet.
As we gather, we acknowledge our church is built on land that was occupied and nourished and cherished by the First Nations people, the Haudenosaunee, and the people known as the Neutrals before them. May we continue to cultivate this land and all living things. Let's take a moment about these slides, these arrowheads I started sneaking in a few months ago. These are Clovis points, first uncovered in New Mexico in the 1930s. With modern technology, we can now date them to at least 13,000 years old. And if you visit the Erie Historical Museum, you can find some that were excavated in Erie County, New York. So that's the deep, deep history of the natives in this land.
Unitarian Universalism is the religion that puts its faith in you. Trusting each individual to engage in the spiritual journey and to reach our own conclusions about spiritual matters. In that spirit, this congregation has created a covenant, a sacred promise of how we will strive to be with one another. Please join me in speaking our covenant. Together we promise, together in compassionate community, to celebrate diversity of thought and unity of spirit, and to seek wholeness for ourselves, our children, and our world. We begin each gathering by lighting the chalice, the symbol of Unitarian Universalism. Our flaming chalice represents the light of truth, the warmth of community, and the fire of our commitment to foster more compassion and justice in a hurting world. Now, as people of faith, with joys and sorrows, gifts and needs, we light this beacon of hope, sign of our quest for truth and meaning in celebration of the life we share together.
All right, thank you very much. Thank you for joining us. As Ron mentioned, Reverend Michelle will be back next week after her 4-month sabbatical. She has a new bionic knee, and she knows how to use it. So I implore you, friends, look busy. All right. I really need to thank the sabbatical team who kept things on track during this sabbatical. Angela Warren, Lorraine Marcus, Reverend Nancy Ferry, Hella Jacob, and Reverend Lisa Peter Angelo. They did indeed hold it together. There were some panic-provoking deadlines, some mad scrambles when I put the wrong video in. They endured some rather pointed observations from me, which I should have probably phrased more delicately. So I apologize for that, but now they can speak like a real professional stagehand. Yeah. It is traditional to offer a round of applause on these kind of occasions, which is nice, but even nicer if you could offer them your thanks, if you get the chance. So now, there we go. Please join together in singing hymn 317, We Are Not Our Own. That is in the gray hymnal.
We are not our own, earth forms us, human leaves on nature's growing vine. Many generations
script on the fly like I promised I wouldn't, and bring you up to date on a story you probably all know. King Minos, ruler of Knossos on the island of Crete, forced the Athenians to deliver 7 youths and 7 maidens every 9 years. They became prey of the Minotaur in the Labyrinth, and Athens escaped further destruction through their obedience. Now, the Minotaur was a terrible monster with the body of a man and the head of a bull, born from the union of the king's wife and the bull, offered as a gift to Minos by Poseidon. We won't go into the particulars of that end of the story. The sacrifices of the Athenians ended when Theseus, son of Aegeus, the king of Athens, traveled to Crete as one of the youths to be sacrificed. He traveled with the intent of killing the Minotaur. Ariadne, daughter of Minos, fell in love with Theseus on first sight and gave him a ball of thread which he unraveled behind him as he walked through the labyrinth. Deep in the heart of the tangled passages, he found and killed the Minotaur. Following Ariadne's thread, he retraced his steps into daylight and was hailed by a hero by everyone, except, of course, Minos. Theseus sailed away, but they did not live happily ever after. Let's just leave the story at that. Okay. By way of that introduction, something a little darker for the invocation, a poem about the Labyrinth by Jorge Luis Borges. Zeus himself, could not undo these nets of stone encircling me. My mind forgets the person that I have been along the way, the hated way of monotonous walls, which is my fate. The galleries seem straight, but curve furtively at the terminus of years. And the parapets have been worn smooth by the passage of days. Here in the tepid alabaster dust are tracks that frighten me. The hollow air of evening sometimes brings a bellowing, or the echo, desolate, of bellowing. I know that hidden in the shadows there lurks another whose task is to exhaust the loneliness that braids and weaves this hell, to crave my blood and to fatten on my death. We seek each other. Oh, if only this were the last days of our antithesis. Are we ready? Labyrinths. All over the place, all shapes, all sizes. Where do they come from? What do they mean? Do they mean anything? What's the fascination? Why does anybody care? Lots of questions and lots of answers, and time again, the answers don't answer anything. If anything, the answers just add more confusion. What is a labyrinth? For our purposes today, it's a single, uninterrupted path in a relatively compact space leading to a central point. Today, I want to talk about and center on labyrinths that can actually be walked, physically large labyrinths on the ground, and only secondarily painted or carved labyrinths that you might find on a wall or even a ceiling. Walking a labyrinth, seriously undertaken, is a ritual. A ritual, in one definition, my favorite definition, is an enactment of something that has always already happened. A labyrinth is a physical manifestation of that definition. It has always already happened. You are walking the steps of heroes. You are walking in the steps of millions. There's a labyrinth from Siberia. Who would have guessed? Spirals, is the spiral a labyrinth? Yes, I guess it is, grudgingly. This is one, as I said, from Siberia. This one is the exception, since we're in the neighborhood. Another slide, please. There we go. It's a beautiful one. That's in an island called Bolshoi Zayatsky, 150 miles from the Arctic Circle in Siberia, north of St. Petersburg, Russia. There are 35 known labyrinths among these islands, 13 or 14 are on this one small island alone, along with hundreds, literally hundreds, of stone mounds and other human-made structures. The oldest ones are believed to be about 2,000 to 2,500 years old, and the newer ones built about 1,400 of the Common Era. In Russia, these structures are called Babylons, after the ancient and nearly mythical city. These were built by the Sami people, who we used to call the Laplanders. They don't care for that term. The deceased are always just another half of the family, and a dialogue is always maintained between the two rituals, which is probably between the labyrinths. So I find an interpretation of labyrinths that are gateways into spiritual realms. And let's go south. This is in western India, near the equator, so from the Arctic Circle to the equator, basically in the village of, I'm guessing at how do you pronounce this, Uzgalimal. The site was discovered in 1993 when monsoon flooding revealed a huge number of carvings in the bedrock, including humans, animals, abstract figures that had been buried for centuries. There's a great deal of controversy about how old these are. Some place them in the early Christian era. Others insist they're far older, as much as 6,000 years old. So that gives us a look of labyrinths from north to south. To the east, it's hard to say how far east they go. I'm told there are labyrinths found in China. I can't find a good image or any reference I can actually trust. And with that, let's go west, all up and down the Atlantic coast from Spain to Portugal, and even over into Iceland. This particular handprint, this is carved in a wall in Sicily. And again, nobody quite knows how old it is. In the English language, labyrinths are distinguished from mazes in there are no side paths. There are no dead ends. You cannot get lost in a labyrinth. And we'll come back and contemplate that in a while. A maze, the term in English goes back to the 1500s, is an amusement designed to deceive and confuse, to amaze those who enter. Most Indo-European languages do not distinguish a maze from a labyrinth, which can cause you some confusion. So here comes a kid's maze. Can you carry the bananas to the monkey? Do we need some time? All right. Here's a garden maze. That's the real thing. This is actually in South Africa. And of course, every year around here we have the corn mazes, and they're kind of a ritual or a new tradition, kind of a modern innovation, but people seem to enjoy them. And here's one closer to home, just out back. A single path, relatively compact space, and a central point. So why do I personally care about labyrinths? They're relatively new to me. The first one I can remember walking was at Summer Institute when I was in Kenyon, Ohio, and one was laid out with string along the main central path, and everybody would walk up and down, and the gravel is crunching, and people are talking, and there's kids. If there are kids in the environment, they will race through a labyrinth. They cannot stop themselves. Kids run in labyrinths, they're riding their bicycles through, and it's a hot, miserable day, and it was not a nice introduction to a labyrinth for me. So I kind of came away and said, yeah. So a few years later, they laid out a Chartres-style labyrinth, which might look familiar. This was in air-conditioned comfort in one of the halls on the Kenyon campus. The Chartres labyrinths are named for the cathedral in France where the design is located. They're about 40 feet wide. They clearly emphasize the Christian cross. And in the center is that rosette with the 6 petals. And you can bet every single thing about them has some sort of meaning, if you care to look them up. Back to my story, Rebecca Benner, a few of you I think may know her, took some drummers, myself included, to percuss for an hour or two one afternoon. We played along. There's some very nice, soft Indian music, and it became very meditative, and we had real quiet instrument, not the big, noisy, jangly drums, but much more subtle things, and it was really just an interesting fulfilling experience. And I thought, well, I would just walk that labyrinth. So I did. 11 circuits in, 33 turns, you're in the center, pause, you take a breath, and things were nice. A little back up to the story. Michelle had just taken her job in South Carolina, a minister's job. I resigned from my job at Pitt Bradford. We're really launching into a great unknown. We'd sold our house, we didn't have jobs. She had a job coming, I didn't have anything lined up. A few days I would leave from Kenyon. I had car keys, I had a little bit of luggage. I had a phone number for somebody I'd never met to call and beg for a place to lay my head. Michelle went home for a week to finish packing and come on south. So I'm walking out of that labyrinth. If you've ever experienced labyrinth, you know that after a couple of turns, you have no idea where you are, right? You're near the center, you're near the outside, you're in a bunch of things, and there's paths everywhere, and occasionally there's other people in there, and where the heck are we going? How do I get out of here? Of course, you get out by simply following the path. All I can say is, as I neared the end, I really just had a total emotional collapse, just a meltdown. And what? I can't even think about it. So all these anxieties and lots of other anxieties and lots of things that had really gone sideways in my life just really poured out. So a few tears. Tears are common in the labyrinth experience. And so I will say, I notice people crying. I don't cry often. Most every day I'm at the church, I'll walk 1 or 2 or 3 of the labyrinths. Tears are not that common anymore. Occasionally I get a funny little jolt that cannot be explained, just like a little electric shock, but it's not electric. And sometimes, and I will encourage you to try this if you're walking labyrinth, you get to the center, just look around, take a breath, and say, this is reality, right? It really brings you to the center of things. All the other concerns just go away, you hope. So often, yes, I don't cry much. I do often feel sad. I don't want to return back to the mundane world. So that's my story of how I got started in labyrinths. A few years later, as you may have surmised, we moved to Buffalo. Michelle held, among some other activities, little after-hours sessions of people building finger labyrinths. Does anybody here still have theirs? Oh, a few of you do, right? They're a lot of fun. I have one at home I look at pretty much every day. Interest grew here in the church about reclaiming the back 40, the land back there, and which is, again, much overgrown. So I sort of started to step into that gap. With the careful planning that characterizes all of my endeavors, I assure you, I looked at a 6-page document on how to build a labyrinth, and I looked at the first page and a half, just the pictures, and said, oh, I can do that, and tore into it with a weed eater. And I had actually staked out a few little corners and messed up on my very first turn and put 2 paths where there should have been 1. I continued in that manner, and as I was nearing the end, thinking I was going to have a 7-circuit labyrinth, I forgot to include an entrance, which defeats the purpose, needless to say. So 2 more turns later, we now have a 9-circuit Scandinavian labyrinth. That's my Scandinavian answer. It's just leaping in, guiding my hands, and that's my story, and I'm sticking with it. And there's a very early shot. That was a really rough-looking shot. And here's the newer one, the one we finished last year. I'll just quote from Facebook, August 8th, 2021. Nearing completion of the new labyrinth at UUCA. Reverend Michelle took the tour and christened it Emergent. in light of our current situation. At that time, we were just, as you may recall, coming out of quarantine, and people were allowed to come out of their bunkers and intermingle a little bit. So Emergent was the name. Here's Joe Rautenstrausch. Did a final sweep after burying many bricks and moving several tons of rock and soil. Robins, catbirds, bunnies, and occasionally deer offer their advice. Bricks and more bricks began arriving in July. Initial layout was back in April. Ground preparation began in late summer 2020. So many thanks to Joe, Linda Gardner, Marjorie Boucher, and Ron Palmieri for their assistance, Angela for her moral support, and the contribution of bricks by Eileen McAllister, Reverend Tim Ashton, and especially Lisa Peter Angelo, who gave us a truckload. Linda Gardner helped me sort out the center, so we invented this star pattern with a round concrete paver. In there is a turkey had volunteered its feather. Thank you, turkey. Thank you, Linda. Marjorie Boucher helped build the wall. The red thing behind it is not Marjorie, that's a deer who came to supervise one evening. As it turns out, we probably have enough bricks to build another labyrinth left over, so be warned, another one is coming. Where do labyrinths come from? Oldest can firmly be dated to 2000 BCE, which is plenty old. Elements that make up labyrinths, specifically variations on the Grecian key, our cave art, which has been dated to 13,000 BC, which is really old. Here's some Grecian key formulas, not like Grecian formula, which I could probably use. Grecian key is a decorative thing, and you'll still see it quite commonly today. It's just everywhere once you start to notice them. Sort of a decorative item for us. It's a simple, endlessly repeating pattern. If you wrap it into a circle, it turns into a labyrinth, or some say it does. Some suggest the Grecian key represents interlocking hands, like this, which was also a hold used by wrestlers, so that kind of gives this an ambiguous meaning. Others theorize the key was a stylized representation of the river Meander, which lies in Turkey. And you're probably familiar with meandering rivers. Yes, there was a river its name came from. Twisting, turning, coming back on themselves. From an internet and anonymous source, for the people of ancient Greece, meander, or meandros, was thought to symbolize eternity and thus the undulating flow of human life through reproduction. The unbroken interlocking pattern turned it into a symbol of both unity and infinity. So there's another interpretation as the river of life, with its twists and turns and backtracking and changing perspectives, finally ending, where does it end, right? And let's not forget, it's about reproduction. Sooner or later, it comes around to that. Here's a floral mosaic from the late Roman era. I wish I had expanded that a little bit. It's a very surprised-looking minotaur there in the center. He looks like he just woke up, and like the phone rang during a nap or something. These labyrinths tend to be purely decorative. You can't really follow them. Where's it start? Where does it end? But they always have this minotaur. So this is a very angular style cultivated by the Romans and carried north into Europe 1,000 years later and carried up into the cathedrals. So it's a very old pattern. It's not one of our standard patterns. The Greeks and the Romans called labyrinths Troy towns after the city of Troy. So we have Babylons in Scandinavia, Troy towns, Troja Berg you might hear, and you might find a place name in Northern Europe, meaning that there was a labyrinth there once upon a time. Here's a picture from graffiti from the city of Pompeii. I suspect alcohol was involved. What it says was, "Labyrinth, here lives the Minotaur." So probably not a compliment to the owner of the house, right? What do these things mean? Well, we don't know who first figured out that classical labyrinth, thank you, or where it happened. The quote from the Theosophical Society, Hold your breath. The 7 circuits of the Cretan labyrinth correspond with the 7 spheres of the sacred planet, the 7 principles of the human being and the cosmos, the 7 days of the week, and other such sevenfold meanings. Passing to the center of the labyrinth and returning to its circumference represents the involution and evolution of the universe, coming into birth and passing out of earthly life as an individual, and most important, a journey to the center of our own being. The achievement there, a quest for wholeness, and a subsequent return to our divine source. That's a lot of things packed into 7 circuits, right? The winding pattern of any labyrinth also represents the circulation of vital energies within our body. That pattern suggests the convolutions of the brain and the intestines, 2 poles of our body corresponding to the consciousness and its physical vehicle. We traverse the labyrinth to bring wholeness, all parts of our being. Walking the labyrinth is therefore a type of yoga. So again, we return to the meditative aspects. In some, it's got all these bodily associations. It's the brain, it's the intestines, and symbolic associations. All those things in our culture that wind up with 7, start with 7, wrap around 7, a really mystical number in Western culture. Here's another thing, and I'm going to skip over a long shaggy dog story about it, but I fell in love with the design, and when we get around to another labyrinth, this will probably arrive, and it's called a Baltic spiral. And I think it would be great for people with mobility issues because you can make the paths very wide, and there's, in fact, the entrance and the exit are different ways, so you don't have the problem with collisions. It led to this one, which is the most recent one we built. The rocks don't stand out very well against the brown mulch. We finished it last July in the Waterhouse Ecology Center. Michelle named it Courage for reasons she has not shared with me. I'm not sure how many people name their labyrinths, but we do. It's called a Chakra Vyuha labyrinth, style found in northern India. In India, labyrinths of this design are often found in homes, often near doorways, as protection against, guess who, malevolent spirits. They also might be painted or chalked on the ground in front of your house, and even though they're worn away or washed away by the rain, the fact that you have done it means its protection remains. Let's go back to Scandinavia. They grow to great proportions, as you can guess, up to 19 circuits, 21 circuits, huge, huge things. Tradition has it the seafarers and seagoing merchants would walk these deliberately to the center and then race out as fast as they could to leave the evil spirits and the nasty entities and the trolls and whatever naughty things behind so they would have good luck on their voyage. Recap: India, labyrinth is protection. Scandinavia, labyrinth is protection. The Roman army, incredibly superstitious bunch. Labyrinths were probably for protection, right? Being a seafaring, a fisherman in the North Atlantic in a tiny boat, and being a Roman soldier fighting barbarians are not things that promise a long, restful retirement, right? You need all the protection you can get. Labyrinths, again, across a really wide area, protective device, trapping those evil spirits. And to England, a turf labyrinth. In England, of course, much of England, you get underneath the soil just a few inches and it's just chalk, pure white chalk. And so they cut away everything that's not a labyrinth, and you get things like this. This is quite a big one, and obviously very well maintained, called turf labyrinths. Strange but true. How old do they go? We don't know. Shakespeare mentions them as the wanton maze in the Commons, so they're certainly part of his experience. Traditionally, turf was recut every year before a village festival of some sort, and then there's a competition about the young men to race to the center for a young woman who's waiting there. So again, running in the labyrinth, and the idea of fertility again raises its head. So, fertility charms, more running, which brings us to North America. Who knew? The man in the maze came to the attention of collectors early 1900s. Museum collections go back to the 1860s, typically as a basket weaving. We really don't know how old they are. Among the Tohono O'odham nation, you may have heard of by their Spanish name, the Papagos. There's a really well-developed narrative, a nice explanation about what these mean. So the design is really something more than somebody came up to sell with tourists, right? They do have a lot of depth to this image. The more you look at it, it is interesting. It turns into a classical labyrinth. Seventh Circuit labyrinth is upside down. The paths are not of an equal width. It's a very interesting design. I'd like to figure out how they figured it out. The figure is called the man in the maze, or sometimes the elder brother or the big brother, and he is quite a magical character. Labyrinth is said to represent every person's journey through life, difficulties, losses, unexpected turns, pauses due to exhaustion and despair. Eventually one reaches the center where one can hopefully survey life in its entirety and reach a peaceful revolution for all that has transpired. Right? A journey through life. Very close to the Theosophists. You're journeying through life. It's a meditative experience, and hopefully you reach a bit of resolution about what you have experienced.
There's a lot to think about. Let's take a pause for a moment to engage with our labyrinth. Each of us carries with us into this worship and cares and concerns, joys and sorrows. Together, we create the container where we can put down our burdens, knowing they are held gently by this gathered, loving community. For those joining virtually, I invite you to give voice to that which is in your heart, or perhaps type it into the chat in the live stream. For those here in the chapel, I invite you to come forward and place a stone or a shell on the table labyrinth in recognition of that which is on your heart.
Let's talk a little bit more about this labyrinth design. It's a Chartres labyrinth, named after the cathedral in France, where one was installed early 1200s. Basic design emphasizes the Christian cross, and that goes back to about the 4th century at least of the Common Era. So it's the first really significant, enduring departure from the classical labyrinth that I've more or less talked about up to this point. So it's an interesting moment in Christianity, 4th century BCE. Centuries of persecution, as you all know, Christians thrown to the lions, driven into the catacombs. In the year 313 CE, Constantine the emperor legalized Christianity across the Roman Empire. By 380, it had become the state religion. During these decades, the cross, which up to that point was really kind of an embarrassing little reminder for the Christian community that Jesus did not come to a good end, slowly found use as a symbol. For the first time, 300 years after the fact, the cross became the symbol of Christianity. During that same era, there was a wholesale destruction of all the remnants of the pagan world. Shrines of local deities just really lovingly tended and cared for centuries were stripped of anything of value and turned into pig pens and cow pens and public urinals. All the great classical monuments were stripped of any goods of value and turned into churches or warehouses or whatever. The great libraries fell into disrepair or sometimes were simply burned outright. So we really have no sense of how much of that era was lost during the 300s into the 400s. Wholesale destruction. Now, I'm going to speculate without any evidence whatsoever, but I think the classical labyrinth was pretty much ubiquitous in the era. Everybody knew what it was. Nobody talked about it because you didn't need to, right? We don't need to talk about our bathrooms and our kitchens and our driveways and our yards. Right? We have them. Everybody knows what they are, what they're about, what they're for. So I think someone recognized that the classical labyrinth was going to go away of all these other things of the pagan realm, and it was going to be a big loss. And so with some manipulation, they came up with a design to emphasize the Christian cross. And the idea took hold, this Chartres-style labyrinth, which took a long time to develop, from the early 300s to about 1200, a long developmental period, but it became very enduring. In fact, we still use them today. And also for the first time, labyrinths, which were a public affair and hard to say what the religious intent was, but for the first time they were carried indoors, and strange but true, into the Christian cathedrals. So something from the heart of the pagan world into the Christian cathedral. Here's the first one we know of a Christian design. Instead of the expected minotaur in the middle, we have this, a word square in every direction. It reads Sancta Ecclesia, sacred church. Just to make sure you didn't think this was something the pagans thought up. Nope, this is now a Christian design. Here's another one from the Cathedral of Lucca in northern Italy, and looking a lot like the Chartres design. Dating's difficult, probably about the year 1200. There's a carving written in Latin next to it. This is a labyrinth constructed by the Cretan Daedalus, from which no one was able to exit save Theseus, thanks to Ariadne's thread. So here come some mysteries and contradictions and explanations that don't explain. There's only one path. There's no way of getting lost. If you have the patience and strength to walk back out after you kill that damn minotaur, you don't need a thread. You don't need a string, right? There's only one path. What's the point? Again and again, we find the minotaur in a labyrinth, and story requires that thread. And another thing, why would the Catholic Church condone an episode from the heart of the pagan, pre-Christian world in the center of their cathedrals? So the easy explanation is that labyrinths became a replacement for pilgrimage to the Holy Land, particularly as that trip became more difficult over the years without going into the deep history. Essentially, the Muslims took over more and more of the Constantinople in the east, and so you just couldn't go there anymore. But you could make that pilgrimage by walking the labyrinth. Labyrinths also became a penance for one's sins, and lots of stories of walking the Chartres labyrinth on their knees as a source of penance for whatever nasty thing they did. So neither story explains why we have the Minotaur inside a Christian cathedral. Another possible explanation, and this is where it starts to get weird. Here's a labyrinth in a text from Pavia, Italy. Theseus entered and killed the double-formed monster. Now, the Minotaur was a legend, and indeed he was monstrous. He was born of this impossible mating between a human female and this wild but really sexy bull, apparently. From this mating came a double-formed monster with a bull's head and a human body, with a ravenous appetite for human flesh. And curiously, this illustration shows sort of more of a centaur, right? A human head on a bull's body. Somebody didn't get the memo. In our Western culture, particularly this Judeo-Christian culture most of it grew out of, it's often a forced distinction between sheep and goats, fish and fowl, clean and unclean, raw and cooked, spirit and flesh, flesh and blood, Jew and Gentile, Jew and Christian, Christians and, unfortunately more and more, everyone else. Right? In that context, this abhorrence for a double-formed beast, as they call him, becomes interesting. We are at this time sorting out the vagaries of sex. Perhaps there's more than just two, right? Perhaps there's a range of it. There's this traditional demand for a sharp distinction. There is no possibility other than male or female. So the conservative worldview, as always, says the biformed, the double-formed are monstrous, ravenous, corrupters of our youth, and must be destroyed. So the labyrinth may represent a passage into the shapeless, the amorphic, and then a return into a clearly defined world. That would parallel another explanation at Chartres, that the journey to the center of the labyrinth follows Christ's harrowing of hell in the Catholic tradition. Perhaps it's useful to remember that Pan, that really ridiculous satyr with the devil's horns and the human head, he's kind of just a character, got turned into the picture of Satan, right? So the general ridiculous, humorous, drunken god Pan became the Christian Satan. So I'm wondering if the Minotaur, locked into the labyrinth due to his monstrous double form, becomes a vision of hell, one that must be conquered. Does Theseus become an emblem of Christ, Ariadne, the divine feminine who provides the rope and the strength and the wisdom to find the way back? Is that thread perhaps a rope to haul himself out of the pit? Is the thread perhaps something that connects us to the outer world? This draws us to the realm of the shaman, to whom a rope is attached as he begins his journey to haul him back to this plane of existence. But I won't follow that today. And the labyrinths. What does labyrinth mean? The easy answer is that it's named for the labyrinth, that sort of double-headed axe you see up there, from the Palace of Knossos. This is a real thing. This is not some modern fantasy thing. These were excavated, and they're found in the museum now. So it's a double-headed axe. Well, that certainly explains everything, doesn't it? Right. The labyrinth doesn't look like an axe. The axe in question is not one carried by dwarves in Lord of the Rings, and it's only ever found in conjunction with the goddess of the labyrinth, who we really don't know the name, but she seems to be otherwise peaceful. And she's often found in conjunction with a butterfly. So the unnamed goddess, the lady of the labyrinth, gives us a hint to what this really means. The answer, beloved by Jungians, is that labyrinths and butterflies, Lepidoptera, are derived from the same root as lips, or labia. I will not show an illustration because this is a family show. So let's take a moment. We have that one image. Here's another image. Let's think about that little guy in the center, right? Little round head, long tail, perhaps something from high school biology comes to mind, or is it just my adolescent mindset running away from me, right? So we potentially have in all these labyrinths, some of the other ones are even more graphic if you go back and look, which I will not because we're already having a long show. The symbolism becomes even more graphic through the lens of this sexual imagery. Anyway, I'm not sure if that's real, but my adolescent mind said, I should probably tell you, and now you're never going to be able to unsee it, right? So can we sum it up? A labyrinth is associated with fertility and reproduction, an entry into the world of pure, amorphous creativity. It's a trip to the underworld or otherworld, a place where the spirits can be contacted. A bodily representation of the twisted, knotted path of the intestines and the convolutions of the brain, the 7 planets, 7 days of the week, 7 circles of hell, 7 dwarves. Any of those things, it's all of those things. Of course, you can't talk about Jung without talking about the shadow self and how we need to recognize it, incorporate it to become a fully realized self. In this view, we might ask if Theseus indeed kills the shadow, which makes for a good story, but terrible psychology, or befriends and incorporates the shadow, or is in fact consumed by the Minotaur, that'd be really bad. Joseph Campbell tells us we can never fully explain a myth. You can only dream the myth onward. We don't really explain anything as we explain all our myths, not just what we're talking about here today. We're simply putting a fresh coat of paint on a very old structure. So what is a labyrinth? It's the walls of Troy, the walls of Jericho, the walls of Babylon, the road to Jerusalem. Those are all different names for labyrinths across mostly Europe. The place from whence we all came, the place of our darkest fears and our deepest destiny. It is a place of death and rebirth. It is the reality of here and now. So, in our contemporary world, labyrinths are made for meditation and healing. In medical studies, they've been found to lower blood pressure, ease the heart rate. They're found, of course, in churches, church properties, schools, prisons, homes, public and private gardens all over the world. As in all meditation exercises, what you bring to it is what you get out of it. So here comes the altar call. Yes, we're near the end. If you haven't experienced a labyrinth, I invite you to do so when you can. There are 3 of them out back. More to come. And that's all I have to say. Please join us in singing Circle Round for Freedom, 155, in the gray hymnal.
Circle round for freedom. Circle round for peace. For all of us imprisoned. Circle for release.
Wow, everything you wanted to know about labyrinths, but we're afraid to ask. It was all covered. Thank you for joining us today. We hope that you've been inspired and uplifted by sharing this time together. You can support the work and mission of the congregation with your financial contributions. For those in our chapel today, you'll find baskets at the back to receive your gift. For those participating virtually, I invite you to take a moment to visit our website. That's uuamherst.org, uuamherst.org, and click on the giving link, or text your gift to 833-987-1968. Please join me as we extinguish our chalice with these familiar words. We extinguish this flame, but not the light of truth, the warmth of community, or the fire of commitment. These we share in our hearts until we are together again.
You reading this, Be Ready by William Stafford. Starting here, what do you want to remember? How sunlight creeps along a shining floor? What scent of old wood hovers? What softened sound from outside fills the air? Will you ever bring a better gift for the world than the breathing respect that you carry wherever you go right now? Are you waiting for a time to show you a better thought? When you turn around, starting here, lift this new glimpse that you found. Carry it into evening, all that you want from this day. This interval you spent reading or hearing this, keep it for life. What can you give anyone greater than now, starting here, right in this room, when you turn around?